Did you know that 1 in 4 women have or will experience intimate partner violence in their lifetime? Domestic violence, unfortunately, is a prominent issue in our society today and is experienced by women, men, and children all over the world. I have known many domestic violence victims who, at first, we didn't realize they were victims. Luckily, the people that I knew were able to escape, but many people who are victims of domestic violence are not able to escape their abusers or situations. In my presentation, I want to clarify what exactly domestic violence is. I will then talk about a charity close to my heart, which is House of Ruth Maryland. Then we can discover how we can help victims of domestic violence. Now let's get right down to it. What is domestic violence? So the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence defines domestic violence as the willful intimidation, physical assault, battery, sexual assault, or other abusive behavior as part of a systematic pattern of power and control perpetrated by one intimate partner to the other. There are actually 3 stages of domestic violence. The tension building stage, which is the threatening and verbal abuse and assault. And then there is the acute battering, which is the physical assault, so punching, hitting, any kind of physical assault. And the last stage is the honeymoon phase, which is essentially, the abuser is apologizing to their victim, they're buying them presents, treating them extra special to gain back that trust of their victim, so then they can repeat it again. It's a continuous cycle. And Wikipedia estimates that 10 million people every year in the United States are domestic violence victims. And according to the Baltimore Sun, domestic violence incidents rose 31% during the 2020 pandemic, including a 20% increase in domestic violence hotline calls. The graph that is shown is the information I gathered from the MD Courts website, and it shows a percentage of protective orders for domestic violence victims they filed it for grounds of assault during the early months of the pandemic. So as you can see, the graph steadily rises over the early months of the pandemic. It actually rises from 39.2% in March of 2020 to 52.6% in May of 2020, which is a huge leap. A popular case of domestic violence in today's media is the case of the murder of Shanann Watts and her 2 young daughters by her husband, Chris Watts. In the video from USA Today, Shanann's father, it's a heartbreaking statement saying God only knows what happened that night. They had all their lives to live and they were taken by a heartless man. Many people outside of a domestic violence situation sometimes cannot identify the domestic violence going on. And domestic violence is both physically and mentally threatening to the victims of domestic violence and their children. So now that we have discussed the devastating effects of domestic violence, let's take a look at who is helping the victims. One organization that helps domestic violence victims is House of Ruth Maryland. It was founded by a women organization in combination with support from many local religious groups. It was founded in May of 1977, and in November of 1977, the House of Ruth Maryland opened up Baltimore's first crisis center for victims of domestic violence and their children, which was very rare at the time because domestic violence was not really seen as a crime in the 70s and during the mid-1900s, so it was very progressive for the time. They have helped thousands of women and their children who have been affected by domestic violence recover and escape from their abusers. They provide shelter for victims and their children, as well as provide counseling and materials they need to get back on their feet. And an interesting fact that I found was that they also offered counseling for abusers to help practice and get rid of their old abuseful habits and help them overcome that, which I thought was very interesting. So how we can help. So we have discussed how House of Ruth Maryland has made an indelible mark on the community. So let's talk about what we can do to help. Domestic violence victims can be helped to recover through support and safety. House of Ruth strives to better the lives of domestic violence victims and their families. So we can help by gathering materials needed for care packages such as toothbrushes and brushes. Things that seem ordinary to us can make a big difference to the lives of domestic violence victims and their families trying to recover. And we can advocate for stricter laws to protect domestic violence victims and their families, and supporting those we know who have been affected by domestic violence. So let us now go over what we have learned today. Domestic violence, unfortunately, is a very common, life-threatening occurrence. Today, there is a lot of help and support that can be provided by great charities such as House of Ruth Maryland, where domestic violence victims and their families are supported and cared for. As a society, there are many ways that we can help those affected by domestic violence as well. One important way that we can help support victims of domestic violence and their families is to advocate for stricter laws that can better protect domestic violence victims. Advocating for more protective laws in the long term will help lessen the chance of domestic violence occurring repeatedly. It is our job to protect those who need it the most. Thank you.